one of you felt restricted to spiritual practices that often seem outdated and of little relevance in today's world? Are you discouraged to express your own creative talents and develop spiritual practices that are uniquely you? The Liturgical Rebels podcast is for people like you who want to reimagine and reconstruct their faith and spiritual practices. It's for those who want to reshape belief and journey closer to God's wholeness with peace, justice, and flourishing, not just for themselves, but for the earth and all its inhabitants. In today's episode, I will be in conversation with Sarah Augustine, Pueblo Piwa descendant, co-founder and executive director of the Coalition to Dismantle the Doctrine of Discovery. She is also the co-founder of Suriname Indigenous Health Fund, where she has worked in relationship with vulnerable Indigenous peoples since 2005. Sarah has represented the interests of Indigenous community partners to their own governments, the Inter-American Development Bank, the United Nations, the Organization of American States, Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, the World Health Organization, and a host of other international actors, including corporate interests. She is a columnist for Anabaptist World and co-hosts the Dismantling the Doctrine of Discovery podcast with Sherry Hostler. Sarah is author of The Land is Not Empty, Following Jesus in Dismantling the Doctrine of Discovery, and co-author with Sherry Hostler of So We and Our Children May Live, Following Jesus in Confronting the Climate Crisis. Sarah, it's a delight to have you with me today. I've really been looking forward to chatting with you ever since I heard you speak at Seattle Mennonite Church several months ago now. And I was deeply impacted by what you said, and I signed up for your newsletter and everything, and I've really enjoyed the correspondence that I've been getting from you. So I think there's a lot that we can talk about today. And, you know, the tremendous challenge that you give all of us white people to decolonize our worldview. And in The Land is Not Empty, you unpack the harm that the doctrine of discovery has done to Indigenous people, to their culture, to their land, to everything about them. Many of our listeners have never heard of the doctrine of discovery. Can you explain what it is and how it has impacted Indigenous people, not only in North America, but really around the world?
You bet. So I want to begin by saying that the doctrine of discovery is really the doctrine of Christian discovery.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a legal and policy structure that was incorporated into the legal canon in the United States in 1823.
Mm.
So it's not sort of an abstract, ancient thing that happened. It is a legal and policy structure that defines reality for Indigenous peoples in the United States. And because it does, it also defines reality for everyone else.
Mm.
And if you think about what the difference between a law, which we kind of know what a law is, or a legal and policy structure or a paradigm that we can think of, most of us understand in our legal system here in the U.S., is segregation.
Mm-hmm.
So segregation was not a law, it was a doctrine.
Mm-hmm.
It impacted all the law. So every institution was defined by segregation. So did segregation impact the education system? Yes. Did it impact the transportation system? Yes. Did it impact the criminal justice system? Yes. And the doctrine of discovery is a legal policy structure just like that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's based on a logic, the same logic that apartheid is based on. In fact, apartheid, as it was developed in South Africa, was based on the system, the reservation system here in the United States and Canada.
Oh, really? Mm-hmm.
And so while that legal and policy structure was dismantled in the 1990s in South Africa, it's still in place here in the United States. And so so now I'm going to tell you sort of the origin story. Where did it come from? The discovery doctrine is a doctrine that determines who is allowed to own and improve land.
Yeah.
Or sovereignty over land. And so as Europeans developed the technology to navigate oceans, of course, Europeans are not the first people to go across oceans, of course, but they developed the technology to bring armies across oceans. And as they did that, there was an international body that was governing European states, and that body was the Catholic Church. And so if you think about international law, the first international law was really imposed by the Catholic Church, the Holy Roman Empire. And so the Catholic Church understood that as these different European states were going out and discovering lands and wanting to inhabit or colonize those places or take resources, whether settler colonialism or whether just colonialism, bringing resources to Europe, that they would be in a state of competition with each other. And so the Catholic Church set up a set of rules about who gets to have what. And that we broadly call the Doctrine of Discovery. And that was incorporated into U.S. law. So I want to make that really clear. This is not something the Catholic Church just did and now it's over. It has been incorporated into legal systems, not just in the United States, but in what we call the discovered world across the globe. So certainly in Australia,
Yes,
New Zealand, Africa, South America, Central America. This is a legal and policy logic that has been incorporated in these various places. Okay, so what the Catholic Church said was only Christian monarchs were empowered by God to own and improve this land.
Yeah.
And so God had ordained it, and that these Christian monarchs were empowered to have complete sovereignty over all the land, including the people on it. And those people in those places, which is everywhere, where there were already people there, if those people were not Christians, then that land was deemed to be terra nullius. A term that means empty. It's empty land. So it's empty and there for the taking. And so different European authorities or monarchs had different ways of coming into these lands they considered to be virgin lands. But those people who were already there certainly did not have the sovereignty, the right to self-determination or control, but a subordinate right to occupancy. So basically what that means is that a state authority, a monarch, or later a state authority could come into that land, set up laws and policies and everything to govern that. And the Indigenous folks have the right to occupancy until the state authority determines that they don't. But they're with complete authority to govern those places. So the Doctrine of Discovery is embedded in the UN Charter. Okay, because the UN is an international mechanism designed for states to come and negotiate treaties and so on, agreements. It's not designed, the United Nations is not designed to hear communities within those states air grievances. So the boundaries of those states are determined across the world by the Doctrine of Discovery. And so
it's just absolutely appalling, isn't it? Absolutely appalling.
And it is the system that we are under today.
Yes.
And I want to say that Indigenous peoples are under threat here and across the world because our institutions are arranged in the way to remove Indigenous peoples from their lands and to eradicate us from the surface of the earth. That's certainly the case here in the United States. And it's the case in many contexts across the globe.
Yeah. Oh, it's just horrible. And believe it or not, I first heard about this from a Welsh person who, of course, England basically took over Wales and Scotland with the same kind of a policy. It's just horrific. And of course, one of the huge impacts was on children and the internment of children in boarding schools. And of course, we've heard quite a bit about this in the last couple of decades, but I don't think people realize the horrible and incredible impact that this had. And it wasn't legitimized, as you said, and encouraged by the church. And I know in Australia, these young people are called the stolen generation. And my husband and I actually worked with some of them probably 20 years ago now, and the pain that they expressed because they had no idea which tribes they belonged to, where they came from, who their parents were. It was my first eye-opening to the huge impact that this had had. And I understand that it's impacted your family. And so can you tell us a bit about that and how it's impacted your life as well?
Sure, I'd be glad to. And I'm glad you brought up England and sort of the colonization of Wales and Scotland. And I'm just going to make a note here about the doctrine of discovery. While it was originated by the Catholic Church, other churches quickly took it up. Of course, England was not under that Catholic banner, but the monarchs there said, well, we want to be part of this too. And there is an agreement to fall under those rules that, the race is on, and the first European monarch to land on a place has the right to it, right? If they're Christian monarch. And so, anyway, I was watching a movie last night. Oh gosh, I don't remember what it was called. And it was a World War II period movie, and it dramatized the children in England being evacuated, where all of these children are being put on boats, or they're being sent to trains in the countryside, and they have sort of a placard around their neck. And the parents are standing there, watching their children go, and they have no idea where they're going or if they're ever going to see them again. And one of the characters said, "Oh, it was, it broke our town because when the Germans invaded, then we were already broken." I thought that was so interesting, that idea of having your children evacuated to be with country people, like your people, for 2 years feels devastating. Now imagine your children being taken by a foreign power, an occupying power, and knowing that you may not see them again for 18 years.
Yeah. Maybe never.
Or
because
maybe
in some places, no records were kept of where they came from.
And in many cases, too, and children died, and their parents were never, they're buried right there in the boarding school. So in the boarding school system here in the United States, and particularly in the West, there were arrest warrants for children 5, 6, 7 years old. They were taken by the force of the authorities. And so I'm now privileged to sit on both the MW062 and A127 commissions of the Episcopal Church, which is trying to address the role of the Episcopal Church in the boarding school system. And so one of the things we're doing together in those commissions is trying to really establish how this process occurred and the roles of various churches in this process. Because, of course, all mainline churches participated in this. The state gave the authority of governance of these schools to Christian denominations, and those Christian denominations were charged with civilizing and Christianizing these children, which basically includes stripping them of language, culture, tradition, traditional clothing. They were institutionalized. They were incarcerated. I want to make that really clear, because we say boarding schools, but so many children in these boarding schools died of neglect, malnutrition. These were concentration camps. These children were put in concentration camps.
About them.
And this went on for decades and decades. This is not like
Yeah.
just something that happened once. This went on generation after generation. In the United States, some of these boarding schools existed into the 1970s.
Yeah. The same in Australia. I think the 60s was when they were finally dismantled. But yeah, it just makes me want to weep. In fact, I'm almost in tears just hearing about it again. But didn't it impact your own family?
Sure enough. And so, and I want to talk about this because the boarding school process was part of a larger process, which is just simply child removal. And child removal, I want to say, is the most effective method of removing Indigenous people from their lands, because what it does is it destroys the opportunity for the next generation to exist in those lands and to thrive there. So in my family, my father was removed in the 1940s from his family at birth. So he was removed from his homeland, separated from his kin at birth, and actually grew up 300 miles away in a Catholic boys' home.
Wow.
He never was adopted, didn't have parents. He grew up in an institution, a Catholic institution. And so he went to public school. He wasn't in a boarding school per se. And so what I want to point out here is that child removal is really much larger than simply boarding schools. For example, there were Christian denominations that had mental health facilities, institutions that were mental health facilities. So the parents would be incarcerated in these mental health facilities, and then the children would be taken and adopted out. So that's the mechanism of child removal. Another mechanism was just simply what my father endured, which is just removal at the hospital itself, just removing children. And the rationale there is that the Indigenous families did not have appropriate. It just felt that those situations were neglectful. Those family homes were neglectful. They're completely in a different culture and context. And child removal, like just adoption homes. I mean, adoption even to this day is often facilitated by Christian institutions. And so Indigenous children filled these adoption homes. And so imagine, it's estimated that there were 100 million Indigenous people here on this continent at the time of colonization. And today in the United States, there are 5.5 million people that are considered to be Indigenous people. But I estimate that number is much larger, and maybe even as large as 25 million, because of the number of children over generations that were removed who passed out of an Indigenous identity.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure as more people get DNA analysis, that this will come to light, I would suspect, in a lot of people, as you say. I'm going to skip to one of my questions here. One of the things that amazes me about you is your deep faith. And I think, how, with all of this that you know, can you continue to be a follower of Jesus? But you say, and this statement, I think, is one of the most powerful statements I've heard. What was done in the name of Christ must be undone in the name of Christ. The good news of Jesus means that there is still hope for the righting of wrongs. Right relationships with God, others, and the earth requires no less. So can you help us understand this, a little about your own faith, and why you're convinced that the good news of Jesus still provides the hope for righting the wrongs?
Yeah, so I just cut right to it, Christine, and say that, I have a relationship with the spirit of life, and that's not abstract to me. It's the driving force in my life. And I am animated by Jesus' radical call. And it's just absolutely the case. It's the driving force in my life. And so the institutions that have co-opted Christianity for 2,000 years, really, or you could say 1,700 years.
Since Constantine.
Those don't reflect the message of Jesus, which is clearly articulated in the gospel. And so, at the time that Jesus was with us here, made flesh, he was clear about his purpose and his mandate, and that purpose and mandate were not popular at that time. At the time when he was alive, any more than they are popular today. Any more than they're popular in the church today.
Yes.
And so, from my point of view, when Jesus comes out of the desert, he's tried and tempted there by the accuser, and he comes for the first time that we understand in the Gospel of Luke, and he comes into the temple and he reads from the prophet Isaiah. To me, that is where he's stating his mandate. And he says, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he's anointed me to bring good news to the poor. That's the mandate. He's anointed me to bring good news to the poor. And so he's reading from the prophet Isaiah, and he articulates what that good news is for the poor. He says that is sight for the blind, release for the captive, freedom for the oppressed, and the announcement of the year of our Lord's favor, which is Jubilee, the just restoring of human systems. So he says, this is what I'm here to do. This is what I'm about. But he could just be reading. We all take our turns in church reading, from various parts of Scripture. But what he does is he then says, today in your hearing, this Scripture is fulfilled. So he says, that's me. I'm here to do that. It's really a mic drop moment. Of course, people were offended. They wanted to throw him off a cliff. And, but I believe that mandate that Jesus embodied is our mandate. That is the mandate that we are also to embody. And that is the mandate that I am prayerfully seeking to embody every single day, because I do believe that Spirit is upon me, that I have been anointed to bring good news to the oppressed. And so have you, Christine. And I think that I think Jesus was so clear about that. He could have made himself the king of the world and chose instead, he said to his disciples, all authority of heaven and earth has been given to me, and I share it with you. And now go and make disciples across all nations. That mandate was then later co-opted, to perpetrate colonization. But if you look at what Jesus actually said and did, it was the opposite of that. He was empowering us to go and to spread the good news with our lives.
Yes. Oh no, I agree wholeheartedly. My first grappling with this was when I worked in the refugee camps on the Thai-Cambodian border back in the 80s. And, kind of really looking at what did Jesus come to do? What is our responsibility to people like this, to refugees, to people that are starving, to people that have been unjustly treated, and that radicalized my life. And I haven't turned back from that. And hopefully I'm still being just as radical.
Oh, I went to a General Assembly of the World Council of Churches some years ago in 2013. And I had this great privilege of interacting with all these heads of there's more than 300 member churches of the World Council of Churches. And I asked all these mainly men, heads of denominations, I asked them, what is the good news? And I did not hear one person articulate what the good news is.
Wow.
I mean, there were all kinds of words that came out, but I thought, gosh, what is this? I met with, of course, all these Indigenous delegates too. There were 50 Indigenous delegates that year from across the world, and there was no question articulating what the good news.
Oh yeah. It just so frustrates me. We've just celebrated Christmas. And we talk about how Jesus coming transforms us. And I look at it and I think, okay, how have we been transformed by this event, and it really does. It frustrates me. And that's one of the reasons for this podcast is trying to help educate people and maybe help people kind of get out there and be more involved.
Appreciate that. And think of who Jesus came to, Christy. I mean, the heavenly host did not appear to the Roman emperor or even the local kings or governors or anything. The heavenly host, the angel of the Lord, appeared to the lowest ranked workers who had to sleep outside with the animals. That's who the spirit, the angel of the Lord came to them and said, don't be afraid. I'm here with good news.
And what did the kings do? They tried to kill him. Right then, they tried to kill this baby.
Right, exactly. I mean, I think in Christmas, we have to ask ourselves, who is transformed by Christmas? I mean, where are we in that story? Where are upper middle class, comfortable people in the Christmas story? Because it's not clear to me that Jesus came for upper middle class Christian Americans. We actually have to do the work of moving our location, putting our bodies next to the bodies of the people that Jesus came to liberate. And that means liberation for us also.
I agree. Yeah. Now, one of the things you often talk about is, and I probably won't pronounce this correctly, Celilo on the Washington-Oregon border, which was the oldest continuously inhabited community in North America until 1957, when the fills and the nearby settlements were submerged by the construction of the Dales Dam. I was horrified to read that. And this obviously was a devastating loss to Indigenous people, and it broke down, the whole fabric of their society.
Right.
So help us to understand how language, culture, economy, and spirituality are tied to the land, and that why this was so devastating and disruptive to Indigenous culture.
Yeah. So
hard questions, I know, but important.
No, I want to begin by just talking about the difference between reverence and faith. So the cosmology of my people, I'll just start there. Tell you what, I speak for myself. The cosmology I've understood that's been taught to me by elders is an acknowledgement that with every breath, I've been taught in my tradition that breath itself is the animator. The great gift I'm given with the first breath I draw in the morning. When I first wake in the morning and I take a breath, that is the great animator providing for me. So when I'm in the morning, I'm praying, I go pray outside and I'm saying, thank you for this land, our body, which is a prayer that was shared with me by a young woman here in Washington State where I live. And I'm acknowledging that the plants that are right there in my back patio are providing, they're enriching the soil. They are creating oxygen, that we have a symbiotic relationship. And I am acknowledging I don't acknowledge that once a week on a Sunday. I acknowledge it every single day. And it's my job to acknowledge it in every way that I can. And so ceremony is a way of acknowledging that and also shaping reality through prayer. And so for the people of that place, which is now called the Confederated Bands and Tribes of the Yakama Nation, that environment, that land is the basis of spirituality. And so Celilo Falls, this important place, this sort of nexus, that place was inhabited, that's right, but it was also a place where different tribes came together to trade. It was the center of the economy. The Yakama people are a salmon people, a fishing people. And so that was the center of, that was the place to procure, I guess is the word I'm going to use, the primary source of protein. It was also a critical ceremonial space because of the bounty, the dependence on that place and the bounty that was available there. And I want to just point out, too, that salmon was the center of the economy for the Yakama people. So I learned this in a really strange way. I lived in central Washington for 18 years on the homelands of Confederated bands of the Yakama Nation. And during that time, I was working at a dispute resolution center at the time, and we were working on a community response team to really elevate missing and murdered Indigenous women. And so we brought together members of the community who were survivors. They themselves had experienced some aspect of trafficking, but mostly the relatives of people who had been murdered.
Mm.
We're trying to elevate this missing and murdered Indigenous women, the very real, concrete policy posture to do nothing about this, And so, anyway, we interviewed a variety of people throughout about a year, and then we held a forum to be brought before federal officials. And so where these folks testified. So I took, I'm a trade mediator, and I took the record. These folks would come in 1 or 2 sessions and tell their story, and then I would transcribe that so that they could have a record of what they said. And when they went before federal officials, if they broke down, would have something to hand them. So what occurred, Christine, during that time was that I heard many people begin their story with the damming of Celilo Falls.
Interesting. Yeah.
So I thought, what does the damming of Celilo Falls have to do with the murder of your relative? And that is a question that really caused me to really learn about what happened at Celilo Falls, because the eradication of that center, it's the center of community life, it's the center of spiritual life, it's the center of the economy. It would be as though I'm trying to imagine a symbol in the U.S. that is even as big as that. I can't even think of one. I mean, it would be the complete destruction of our economy.
Yes.
For example, if you would completely disrupt our food system, the ability to grow food and distribute it across the nation. That's what happened to this people at Celilo Falls. And that economy was replaced with nothing. Nothing. And in fact, as the people have tried to seek a livelihood, they are thwarted with a legal system that prevents Indigenous people from seeking a livelihood. And so over and over again. And so the story begins there because the rupture of a life, any kind of a life that is productive and sustainable, the complete rupture of that began with this catastrophic event, the dam of Celilo Falls, where the most powerful colonizing force on earth, the United States, chose to dam this river, the Columbia, at this place, to create hydropower. So in our narrative today in the U.S., we say, oh, hydropower, it's sustainable power. It's devastating to Indigenous people. Absolutely devastating. And so what happened as a result of that is that, imagine, every single person in this community lost their job.
Yes.
As a result of that. So, and there's no alternative. So first of all, imagine what that would be like if every single person lost their job and there's no other way to seek a livelihood. Where now will you get protein when this access has been denied? And then you also have at the same time the Dawes Act, which is taking the reservation, putting it into parcels. The Yakama people historically were people who migrated within the boundaries of their homeland on a cycle, following various access to food. So they had a summer camp, they had a winter camp, the various access to food and fiber and medicines and so on. And now they have to, most of them are put on a 40-acre dry parcel, no access to the river. What does that even mean if you're in the Yakama cosmology, to be on a 40-acre parcel of dry land?
Yes.
It's absurd. And so, of course, as a result of that, you also have the boarding school system that's going on, the draining away of children from the community, all of these things that result in, well, just the breaking of the tribe.
Yes.
So that now women are so expendable by the dominant culture that they can be kidnapped and taken and murdered, where you can even find their bones on the reservation and there's no intervention from any quarter.
Wow.
It's now the reality of Indigenous people on that reservation. In fact, youth there in the Yakima Reservation are 7 times more likely to commit suicide than another Washingtonian youth.
It's not surprising. I mean, and then we wonder why Indigenous people become homeless, become alcoholics and addicted to drugs. And it's like, well, of course they do. Just as vets coming back from the impact of war suffer from these things, these people have had 10 times, tenfold the trauma on their society and on their beings as the people that come back from war.
Oh,
And, it's not surprising that they struggle with these things.
the solution is self-determination. That's the solution, is self-determination. If Yakima people are allowed to have sovereignty over their lands, they're able to create their own economy, and they're able to determine whether there's going to be a dam there or not, and they're able to actually determine their own life outcome, that is the thing. I mean, I think what people in the dominant culture think is, oh, well, we're going to give charity, or we're going to, I mean, there's nothing wrong with repair. So sorry about that.
That's okay. Yeah, you were just talking about how we want to give people charity. And so let's start with that. If you can kind of, how we go for charity rather than something else.
Right. So this is a place in the Christian narrative that's really well worn. And it's the idea that we as Christians, primarily white Christians, are good people, and we are living the good life by being thrifty and by being working hard, and all these parts of the narrative, that we are able to share our excess, our largesse, with those people that are less fortunate. And I want to dismantle that narrative right now. Settler descended people, especially those people who are benefiting from historical wealth, are benefiting from the destruction of my people. That is to say that these systems we live in, are arranged to benefit the descendants of settlers and to harm my people. And so this idea of charity is this idea of, we are good people who are sharing our excess, as opposed to saying we are the beneficiaries of structural harm or structural violence, and we seek repair. We seek to repair that damage. One of the most difficult things about charity is that it's usually you have to prove yourself to be worthy. And those people who are giving charity want to control where the money goes and how it's spent. And that is reinforcing an imbalance of power.
Yes.
So repair is the opposite of that. Repair is the acknowledgement of unfair gain and the mutual determination of what is required to repair that. And then the empowerment of Indigenous people in their own self-determination, where they determine how the money is going to be spent without provision from the beneficiaries of harm. And so that is what we seek to do in the Coalition to Dismantle the Doctrine of Discovery, is to balance power. So right relationship, as we understand it in an Anabaptist context, is the balancing of power. So right now we have a situation where power is imbalanced. And to balance power, what has to happen to the people up here, the people with more power? What do they have to do in order to balance power?
They need to give it, yeah. Yeah.
Give it power. And I think that's where charity is messed up, because it's belief that I don't have to give up anything.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. So what do you think of land back programs?
We have a land back program in the Coalition too. In fact, we have a land back, we call it our rematriation fund. And the purpose of this fund is to join monies from a variety of people from around the country. You don't have to have significant wealth to participate, to join these monies together and then aid our partners, Indigenous partners, as they seek to purchase land.
Wonderful. Wonderful. And, another area that you're very concerned about, of course, is the destruction of God's good creation. And how so much of Western society kind of sees the land as a resource that we can just kind of use however we want to. And I know some steps are being taken. I mean, for example, I do know that in Australia, the management of some national parks has been turned back to Indigenous people. But, they're small steps. So in what ways do you feel Indigenous people could lead white European colonizers towards better stewardship of the land?
Certainly. And from my point of view, when most people who are, just regular church people feel like land return means I have to give up my house to Indigenous people. And that's not really what land return is all about. There are, of course, I really advocate for governance of land, control of land, state-owned land, federal land, for these things, at least for consultation to occur with the Indigenous people for whom that is their traditional homeland.
Mm-hmm.
We are the best equipped to know how best to use that land and what's going to be what's the best management for ensuring that that place is going to be available for generations to come. Mm-hmm. And so this is another part of the cosmology of my people, or at least as I've learned it from the elders who have sat with me, is understanding that this creation, we are a part of it. We're not at the center of it. And everything that we do on the land matters. And we're not the center because we're mutually dependent. We're in a web of mutual dependence. And that is a very different frame and framework than a capitalist framework, which says land is just simply a set of raw resources to be exploited.
Yes.
And so we've been in community for several years in the coalition with community groups of Mayan people who have struggled to ensure that that water has rights under the Constitution and is not simply a resource to be consumed, but actually a being with spirit. And so the idea that we are in relationship with the land and it is in relationship with us. So the prayer that I was talking about earlier acknowledges this. Thank you for this land, our body, which is to say, not thank you for this land that nourishes us. Thank you for this land that we get to care for. No, our body, it's my very body. And health of the land is the health that I feel in my body. And the ill health of the land is also ill health that I will hold in my body. And so this sort of orientation to the world, well, it embodies a different kind of logic than the logic of capitalism. And as we return control of land, as we can imagine returning control of land to Indigenous partners, there's a different set of criteria in terms of what that management looks like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, it's so important to think about. So how do you think white people, I mean, I'm sure some people listening to this are really going to feel, wow, there's nothing I can do. But, there are things that people can do. So how do you think white people can most effectively support Indigenous people in their fight to decolonize the worldview?
So first thing I want to do is invite you to be part of the coalition to dismantle the Doctrine of Discovery. Our coalition is a coalition that was designed to accompany and to prepare settler descended Christians as settler descended Christians join the movements of Indigenous peoples. And so that's what we do. White folks, this is a coalition for you. We need you and we want you. And I want to say too, in the dominant narrative, we are told all of our lives that we're consumers. I was in Whole Foods, I don't know, some weeks ago, and there's a little cart and there's a flag that says consumer in training. So think about that from the time, a little mini cart for a child to push. Think of that. For our whole lives, we're taught that we are consumers and friends. That's not who you are. You are an eternal being of spirit.
Mm-hmm.
You are an eternal being of spirit. You are not a consumer. And so we try to say, oh, I'll participate through as a consumer through what I buy or what I don't buy and what I boycott. We have to pull together as a collective and use our mutual life energy, our creativity, our intelligence, our attention to address colonization. And that's what we're seeking to do in the coalition. And we want you and we need you. We have working groups doing a variety of things, everything from culture change, decolonizing Christianity, writing theology, working on economic theology, especially this year around economic justice. We do a variety of different things depending on the energy of our volunteers right across the country as we join.
And I understand you now have an online worship session too.
We have worship twice a month. If you're interested in that, we would love for you to join us.
That context, this information will be in the show notes so people can connect to you in that way. Yeah.
Yes. Our website is dismantlediscovery.org. And so you can find our calendar there, and all of our public meetings are available. Would love for you to worship with us as we work together to imagine decolonized worship and to embody decolonized worship and the way we interpret scripture and everything through decolonizing lens. And so, we are striving to be community together, and we need you. We have to quit thinking about the individual actions one person can do and begin to imagine what we can do as a collective.
Well, thank you, Sarah. This has been so good, so educational, I think, for people. And hopefully you will gain some more supporters through this interview. It certainly taught me things that I didn't know, and I think that it will have very much done that for others. So thank you very much for your time today.
It's been a pleasure, and so good to connect with you, Christine. Thank you.
And you too. For today's episode, I was in conversation with Sarah Augustine, a Pueblo descendant, co-founder and executive director of the Coalition for Dismantling the Doctrine of Discovery. In this conversation, we delved into the Doctrine of Discovery, its historical implications for Indigenous peoples, and the ongoing impact of colonial policies, particularly through forced incarceration in boarding schools. We discussed the deep-rooted effects of child removal and cultural erasure, while also exploring the intersection of faith and social justice, emphasizing the need for healing and restoration in the context of Christian teachings. Sarah Augustine and I explored the devastating impact of the damming of the Celilo Falls on Indigenous culture and the need for a shift from charity to repair in supporting Indigenous communities. We discussed the importance of land-backed programs and how white people can effectively support Indigenous movements towards decolonization and environmental stewardship. In the next episode of Liturgical Rebels, I will be in conversation with Alan Hirsch, who is widely considered to be a global thought leader in missional movements and leaderships. Alan is Jewish by birth, South African by nationality, and now lives in Australia. He is the author of numerous award-winning books, including The Forgotten Ways, The Shaping of Things to Come, Re-Jesus, and Reframation. He is a founder of Movement Leaders Collective, Forge Missional Training Network, and the 5Q Collective. He currently lives with his wife, Debbie, near Melbourne, Australia. I am Christine Sine, the author of Celtic Advent Following an Unfamiliar Path and of The Gift of Wonder. My other books include Digging Deeper, The Art of Contemplative Gardening, and To Garden with God. I also write regularly on Substack. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to hit like and subscribe to the podcast. Please also share it with your friends or join me on Substack, Instagram, or Facebook.